What if the ancient world left behind an object that does not belong to its own time? An artifact that quietly contradicts the order of history we have learned to trust. What if, beneath layers of dust and museum glass, there rests a small, unassuming vessel whose very existence unsettles the idea that civilization advances only step by careful step? Across southern Mesopotamia, between the slow curves of the Tigris and Euphrates, archaeology records a puzzling rhythm. Around 3200 BCE, the Sumerians appear suddenly in the historical record with writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and monumental architecture already in place. There is no long prelude, no clear sequence of failed experiments preserved in clay. Instead, the earliest tablets already speak in a mature language, calculate with a base 60 system still used to measure time today, and describe a world that feels inherited rather than invented. Then there are the gaps. At UR, excavations led by Leonard Woolley uncovered a thick, sterile layer of river silt, several meters deep, separating earlier settlements from later Sumerian cities. Above it, civilization resumes with surprising confidence. Below it, traces of another world remain fragmented and mute. Similar flood deposits appear at Kish, Shuruppak, and Uruk, echoing ancient texts that speak of a great inundation dividing history into a before and an after. And within museum collections, often catalogued cautiously as vessels of unknown purpose, sit objects dated to antiquity that seem to require knowledge their age was never meant to possess. Precision metalwork, optical stone, chemical residues suggesting deliberate use. Each one small, each one quiet, each one asking the same question in a different way. Tonight, we begin with that question, not to resolve it, but to follow where it leads. Welcome to Cryptic Realm Channel, a place for slow histories, unresolved evidence, and the spaces between what we know and what we assume. As we move forward, ask yourself gently, if something here does not fit, is it the artifact that is out of place, or the story built around it? If an object truly does not belong to its own century, the first thing it disrupts is not chronology, but confidence. We like to imagine the past as a clean staircase, stone to copper, copper to bronze, bronze to iron, and only then, much later, toward the invisible forces of chemistry and electricity. Yet the soil of Mesopotamia does not always cooperate with that comforting sequence. It offers layers that feel orderly, and then, without warning, it offers interruptions. A jar, a lens, a drill mark cut too neatly into stone that should have resisted every tool we think existed at the time. The landscape where these questions begin is deceptively simple. Southern Iraq is a flat, breathing plain stitched together by the Tigris and Euphrates. In spring, the rivers swell, carrying silt the color of old clay. In summer, heat tightens the air until the horizon trembles. For thousands of years, life here depended on controlling water, digging canals, maintaining levees, reading the sky for signs of rain or drought. The society that learns to measure water learns, almost without noticing, to measure time. And once time becomes measurable, it becomes recordable. By around 3200 BCE, that impulse hardens into the first known writing systems. Clay tablets impressed with reed styluses, marks that begin as pictures and become sound, number. That is the official milestone, the one printed cleanly in textbooks. But the deeper unease comes from how complete the Sumerian world appears at the moment it becomes visible. Early tablets are not childish attempts. They already track grain, labor, land, and trade with an administrative precision that implies institutions behind them, temples that collect surplus, officials who enforce standards, schools that train scribes. Their mathematics uses base 60, a choice so embedded that it survives into the present in the 60 minutes of an hour and the 360 degrees of a circle. Their cities, Uruk, Ur-Third, do not look like experiments. They look like systems. Ziggurats rise in stacked terraces of baked brick, aligned with an attention to orientation that hints at astronomy, not merely construction. Then archaeology shows you the first real fracture. In the 1920s at UR, Leonard Woolley's team cut down through layers of occupation, pottery, ash, floors, walls, until the familiar debris of human life suddenly stopped. What remained was a thick band of clean river silt, a sterile layer with almost nothing in it, as if the city had been erased and overwritten by water. Below that silt, signs of habitation returned again. Earlier pottery, earlier building styles, evidence that people had lived here, then vanished under flood deposits, then returned later to build on top. Other sites in the region have revealed comparable flood layers, not always identical in date or thickness, but persistent enough to suggest that Mesopotamia experienced catastrophic inundations capable of breaking cultural continuity. The land remembers water in its stratigraphy, even when human memory turns it into myth. And myth here is not a decorative afterthought. Mesopotamian texts, most famously the Sumerian king list and later flood narratives echoed in Akkadian literature, speak of a dividing line. The flood swept over, and afterward kingship descends again. Whether those kingly reigns before the flood are symbolic or literal is debated, but the structure is unmistakable, a before and an after, separated by disaster. Even the Sumerian idea of the me, sacred codes, or templates for civilization, spanning kingship, craft, ritual, and order, frames knowledge as something held, guarded, transferred, restored. It is a subtle but important posture, not invention from nothing, but recovery from loss. This is the atmosphere in which strange artifacts become unsettling. Because once you accept that floods can bury cities and sever traditions, you must also accept another possibility, that some things survive the break in odd forms. Objects moved, repurposed, misunderstood, stored, or quietly reclassified. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, European and Iraqi excavations pulled tens of thousands of items from the ground. Most fit. Some did not. A polished piece of rock crystal from Nimrud, discovered in the mid-1800s, shaped with a curvature that can focus light. Stone vessels showing drill holes so clean and concentric they seem to belong to a workshop with a steadiness we struggle to reconstruct. And, nearer to Baghdad, a small clay jar found in the 1930s at Kujut Rabu, dated roughly to the Parthian period around the 3rd century BC, far later than Sumer, yet still ancient, containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod sealed with bitumen, showing corrosion patterns consistent with acidic liquid. None of these objects alone proves a lost science. Each can be explained away, if one prefers the safest explanation, but together, they form a mood. A quiet insistence that the past is not always linear, that the ground sometimes preserves results without preserving the steps that led to them. And if the steps are missing, the question becomes unavoidable, even if asked softly. Are we looking at clever accidents, at craftspeople discovering effects without naming them, or at fragments of knowledge carried across a break we have not fully learned to measure? When archaeologists confront an object that refuses to settle into its assigned era, the first response is often restraint rather than excitement. History, after all, is built on patterns, and patterns depend on repetition. An anomaly can be tolerated, but only if it remains isolated. The discomfort begins when the anomaly quietly repeats itself in different places, under different layers, described in different ways, yet pointing in a similar direction. Mesopotamia offers several such repetitions, scattered across time and geography, never close enough to form a single narrative, yet close enough to trouble the edges of one. Consider the small clay vessels unearthed near modern Baghdad in the early 20th century, most famously at Kujut Rabu, a site dated to the Parthian period around 250 BCE. At first glance, the object appears ordinary, an unglazed terracotta jar, the kind used throughout the ancient world for storing food or liquid. Inside, however, sits a thin copper cylinder fitted precisely to the interior, sealed at the base with a copper disc. Suspended down the center is an iron rod, held in place by an asphalt plug that prevents contact between the two metals. When conservators clean these pieces, they notice something curious. The iron showed uneven corrosion, concentrated where it would have been submerged. The copper interior carried green oxidation patterns consistent with prolonged exposure to acidic liquids. This was not the random decay of burial, it looked like use. In 1938, the German archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig proposed a cautious but unsettling idea. These vessels might be galvanic cells, capable of producing a small electrical current when filled with an electrolyte such as vinegar or fermented fruit juice. His suggestion was largely set aside, not because it was impossible, but because it complicated too much at once. Electricity, even in its simplest form, is a modern word burdened with modern assumptions. Yet decades later, replicas built with period-appropriate materials produced measurable voltage, modest, but real, enough to support hypotheses about electroplating or ritual sensation. The design worked, whether or not its makers named the effect. The discomfort deepens when this object is placed beside others that pose a different kind of question. In the ruins of Nimrud, excavated in the 19th century, a small piece of rock crystal was found, ground smooth on one side and carefully curved on the other. Modern testing shows that it can focus light, magnifying details with a precision that suggests intentional shaping rather than decorative accident. To grind crystal into such a form requires patience, yes, but also an understanding, however practical, of how curvature bends light. The object does what lenses do. That fact alone is difficult to ignore. Stone vessels from Sumerian contexts introduce a third repetition. Diorite and granite bowls, drilled with holes so cylindrical and so evenly cut that experimental archaeology struggles to replicate them using reconstructed copper tools and abrasives. The grooves left by the drills suggest consistent rotation and pressure, not the wobble of improvisation. Similar observations were made in Egypt by Flinders Petrie in the late 19th century, who noted drilling rates that exceeded what copper tools should achieve against such hard stone. These marks do not announce a lost machine, they simply hint at techniques we do not fully understand. Each of these artifacts can be explained in isolation. The jars might be ritual containers. The crystal could be ornamentation. The drill marks could be the product of extraordinary patience and skill. But taken together, they generate a subtler unease. They suggest that ancient craftspeople sometimes produced results that look less like experimentation and more like application. And when application appears without visible development, it raises a quiet, persistent question. What traditions were guiding their hands? And how much of that guidance has slipped through the breaks in history we have learned to call myth? If these objects were shaped by intention rather than accident, then intention itself becomes the next mystery. Tools do not arise in a vacuum. They are answers to needs, shaped by habits of thought, embedded in cultures that decide what is worth preserving and what can be forgotten. To approach that question, it helps to step away from the artifacts themselves and listen instead to the language that surrounded them. The words pressed into clay by hands that believed they were recording order, not speculation. Sumerian writing does not begin as poetry. It begins as accounting. The earliest tablets list sheep, barley, labor days, and rations. Yet even in this practical form, the language already shows complexity. Sumerian is a linguistic isolate, unrelated to the Semitic languages that later dominate Mesopotamia, and it appears in the archaeological record without obvious ancestors. There are no half-formed versions waiting in earlier layers, no clear trail of simplification leading backward. The grammar is already intricate, capable of expressing agency, time, and causation with precision. For a society just learning to write, it speaks with unexpected confidence. Within this written world appears a concept that resists easy translation, the me, often described as divine decrees or cosmic ordinances. The me encompass everything that makes civilization recognizable: kingship, priesthood, craftsmanship, music, justice, metallurgy, even the correct way to lament the dead. They are not portrayed as inventions of humans. They are described as possessions, guarded by gods, transferred, lost, and restored. When texts recount moments of crisis, the danger is not merely famine or invasion, but the loss of the me themselves, as if order could unravel if these codes slipped from memory. This framing matters because it reveals how the Sumerians understood knowledge. Skill was not merely learned, it was entrusted. Craft traditions were bound to temples and scribal schools, institutions designed to preserve continuity across generations. Young scribes copied older tablets not to innovate, but to maintain accuracy. Errors were corrected, variants noted, older forms preserved long after spoken language had shifted. By the time Akkadian became dominant, Sumerian survived as a scholarly and ritual language, much like Latin in medieval Europe, no longer spoken at home, yet still carrying technical, legal, and sacred authority. In temple inventories from cities like Uruk, objects are listed with a specificity that feels closer to engineering than myth. Vessels of copper distinguished from ordinary lamps. Stones described for their clarity and their ability to aid sight. Liquids categorized not just by ritual purity, but by their sharpness, a term also used in medical texts to describe acidic substances. These are not poetic flourishes. They are labels meant to ensure that the right object reaches the right place. That function is preserved alongside form. Medical and technical tablets reinforce this impression. Recipes specify measurements, heating times, and the avoidance of certain metals in particular mixtures, suggesting awareness of chemical reactions, even if framed in ritual language. Astronomical texts track the movements of Venus across years, requiring sustained observation and record-keeping beyond a single lifetime. Mathematics appears not as abstraction for its own sake, but as a tool for managing land, labor, and construction already mature in its methods. Seen through this lens, the strange artifacts no longer feel entirely out of place. They begin to resemble the physical counterparts of written instructions, tools shaped according to principles embedded in language and practice. If knowledge was preserved in texts, taught in schools, and guarded as sacred inheritance, then it could survive disruption even when the context that first produced it did not. Floods could bury cities. Empires could fall. But a tablet, copied carefully, could carry a method forward. The question that lingers is not whether the Sumerians understood electricity or optics in modern terms. It is whether they were heirs to procedures whose origins they no longer questioned, techniques that worked because they had always worked. And if so, then the real disappearance in ancient history may not be of objects, but of explanations, lost somewhere between the world that taught these methods and the world that continued to use them without fully remembering why. If explanations were the first things to vanish, then catastrophe is often where the trail grows cold. Not the sudden drama of myth, but the quieter violence of environmental change, when landscapes shift faster than memory can adapt. Mesopotamia, for all its fertility, has always lived on the edge of instability. Its rivers give life, but they also erase. Their courses wander. Their floods ignore human boundaries. In such a place, survival depends on continuity, and continuity is most vulnerable when water rises without warning. Geological studies across the lower Tigris-Euphrates basin show that large-scale flooding was not an anomaly in the early Holocene, but a recurring condition. Sediment cores taken near ancient city sites reveal alternating layers of occupation debris and water-laid silt, suggesting cycles of settlement, destruction, and rebuilding. Around the late 4th millennium BCE, several sites show particularly thick flood deposits, far exceeding seasonal inundation. These are not traces of gentle overflow. They point to events capable of sweeping away houses, tools, and archives in a matter of days. Ancient texts remember this not in data, but in structure. The Sumerian king list divides time cleanly. Kingship exists, then the flood comes, and afterward kingship descends again. The length of rains contracts dramatically after this break, as if time itself has changed texture. Later Akkadian versions, and eventually the Epic of Gilgamesh, preserve the same memory in narrative form. A man is warned. A vessel is built. Craftsmen and seeds are saved. Knowledge, not just life, is carried across water. These accounts are not geological reports, but they encode an awareness that something essential was almost lost, and that survival depended on selection. Archaeology quietly supports this selective survival. Organic materials vanish easily in floods, but stone, fired clay, and metal endure. Libraries of unfired tablets dissolve, while a few baked ones remain. Tools made of wood are swept away, while their stone counterparts persist. A technological tradition rooted in durable materials could leave scattered remnants even when the broader system collapses. What survives would look incomplete, isolated, and strangely advanced compared to what comes after. This pattern is visible beyond Mesopotamia. In southeastern Anatolia, Göbekli Tepe rises from a much earlier horizon, dated to around 9600 BCE. Massive stone pillars, carved with animals and symbols, arranged with geometric precision, were erected by communities long thought to lack permanent settlements or agriculture. Then, deliberately, the site was buried. The knowledge required to plan and execute such construction did not vanish overnight, but its expression changed. Thousands of years later, organized urban life reappears elsewhere, carrying different forms of complexity, as if drawing from a shared but altered inheritance. Within this broader rhythm, the Sumerian world can be seen less as a beginning and more as a reassembly. Irrigation systems, standardized weights, and administrative control emerge in response to a landscape that demands coordination. Temples become centers not only of worship, but of storage, education, and regulation. Knowledge concentrates where it can be protected. What cannot be protected is simplified, ritualized, or allowed to fade. In such conditions, it is not difficult to imagine how a procedure could outlive its theory. A method for shaping stone or assembling metals might be taught as tradition, its origin attributed to divine instruction rather than empirical reasoning. Over generations, the explanation thins, but the practice remains because it works. When later scholars encounter the results, they see precision without context, effect without cause. The unsettling possibility is that history's most dramatic losses are not marked by absence, but by survival in fragments. A vessel that still functions, a lens that still focuses light, a drilled stone that still bears the trace of a steady hand, each one a survivor of a world reorganized by water. And if floods can reorder landscapes so thoroughly, what else might they have rearranged in human memory, leaving us with artifacts that feel advanced not because they are misplaced in time, but because time itself has been interrupted? Interruption does not always announce itself with destruction. Sometimes it arrives as adjustment, as a slow narrowing of what a society chooses to remember. After the floods recede and cities are rebuilt, priorities shift. Survival demands order, and order favors stability over exploration. In Mesopotamia, this transition is visible in the way knowledge becomes institutionalized, bound to temples, regulated by scribal schools, and increasingly framed as inheritance rather than inquiry. By the early dynastic period, around 2900 BC, Sumerian city-states such as Uruk, Lagash, and Kish operate within a carefully balanced system of competition and ritual obligation. Each city honors its patron deity, each maintains archives, each trains scribes to reproduce texts with fidelity. Innovation is not discouraged, but it is constrained. What matters is continuity, keeping canals flowing, redistributing grain, maintaining calendars aligned with the heavens. In this environment, techniques that already work are preserved with care, while their origins recede into sacred language. The tablets themselves reveal this narrowing. Technical procedures are recorded, but often without explanation. A recipe lists ingredients and steps, not theory. A construction plan specifies ratios, not derivations. A medical text instructs which metals to avoid when preparing a compound, but does not elaborate on chemical mechanisms. The assumption seems to be that the practitioner already belongs to a lineage of knowledge, one that does not require justification. Understanding is practical, embedded in repetition, safeguarded by tradition. This is also the period when craftsmanship reaches remarkable heights. Stone vessels of extreme hardness are shaped with symmetry that suggests standardization. Metal alloys are produced with consistent composition, implying controlled processes rather than experimentation. Musical instruments follow tuned ratios. Weights and measures are harmonized across regions, facilitating long-distance trade from the Persian Gulf to Anatolia. These achievements do not point to technological infancy. They point to refinement. Yet refinement can be deceptive. A refined practice may be the final stage of a much longer development whose earlier phases are no longer visible. If the developmental steps were erased by flood, migration, or deliberate abandonment, what remains looks sudden, even miraculous. Archaeology, bound to what survives, must reconstruct entire histories from what is left behind, not from what was lost. This tension appears again in the way later cultures inherit Sumerian knowledge. Akkadian rulers adopt Sumerian writing for administration. Babylonian scholars copy Sumerian mathematical and astronomical texts centuries after Sumerian is no longer spoken. The language becomes a vessel for precision, a container that preserves methods even as cultural contexts change. What was once living knowledge becomes canonical, less questioned, more revered. Within such a system, a device whose function is understood through practice but not theory could persist quietly. It might be used sparingly, reserved for specialized contexts, temples, workshops, elite production, never widespread enough to leave abundant traces. Over time, its purpose might be reframed symbolically. A sensation becomes a sign of divine presence. A visual enhancement becomes a sacred clarity. The tool survives, but its explanation drifts into metaphor. The danger, from a modern perspective, is assuming that absence of explanation implies absence of understanding. Ancient societies often encoded technical knowledge in ritual and myth not because they were incapable of rational thought, but because those frameworks ensured transmission. A method tied to divine order is less likely to be altered carelessly. A craft guarded as sacred is less likely to be forgotten entirely. As Mesopotamian civilization stabilizes and expands, the visible record becomes richer but also more uniform. The questions narrow. What lies beyond the established order matters less than maintaining it. And in that narrowing, some possibilities slip quietly out of view. The artifacts remain, embedded in collections, described in cautious language, waiting for someone to notice not what they are, but what they imply about the paths history chose not to record. Stability, once achieved, has a way of reshaping memory. It encourages societies to look forward only as far as the next season, the next harvest, the next rain. In Mesopotamia, this inward turn becomes visible as city-states grow into kingdoms and then empires, each one inheriting the same river-bound challenges and responding with increasingly centralized control. Authority consolidates. Archives expand. Yet the deeper past grows quieter, compressed into formulas that no longer invite scrutiny. By the time of the Akkadian Empire in the 24th century BCE, Sumerian cities are no longer independent centers of power. Sargon of Akkad unifies the region through military force and administrative innovation, binding diverse populations under a single political language. Sumerian culture does not disappear, but it changes role. Its language becomes classical, its texts authoritative, its past increasingly distant. Knowledge is preserved, but also sealed. What once may have been flexible practice becomes fixed reference. This transformation affects how unusual objects are understood. An artifact that once had a clear function within a living tradition can become opaque when that tradition narrows. If a tool's use depends on a sequence of actions no longer taught openly, it may survive only as form. Its materials endure, its assembly remains intact, but its purpose is recast as ritual, symbolic, or simply unknown. The artifact is not lost, its meaning is. Archaeological layers from this period show continuity with subtle shifts. Temples grow larger. Administrative tablets multiply. Standardization deepens. Yet innovation, when it appears, tends to refine rather than redefine. Military technology advances in predictable ways: bronze weapons, organized infantry, siege tactics, But there is little evidence of experimental leaps in material science. This does not mean such knowledge did not exist. It means it was no longer visible as a frontier. Frontiers move when societies feel safe enough to explore them. Empires, preoccupied with holding territory, rarely feel that safety. The paradox is that empires are excellent at preservation. Clay tablets survive precisely because they were copied and stored systematically. Architectural plans persist because they are reused. Ritual objects endure because they are protected. But preservation favors repetition. It protects what is already known and discourages deviation. In such an environment, a device that does not fit neatly into administrative or military categories risks marginalization, even if it continues to function. Later Mesopotamian texts offer hints of this marginal status. Inventories list objects without explanation. Commentaries preserve procedures without context. Scholars annotate older tablets without fully understanding their origins. The act of copying becomes an end in itself, a defense against forgetting rather than a path toward rediscovery. Knowledge survives, but curiosity recedes. This pattern repeats as Mesopotamian influence wanes and new powers rise. Babylonian scholars inherit Sumerian mathematics and astronomy, maintaining precision while gradually abstracting meaning. Assyrian kings build vast libraries, collecting texts from across the region, yet framing them as relics of a venerable past rather than tools for innovation. By the time Greek observers encounter Mesopotamian knowledge centuries later, it appears ancient, authoritative, and strangely complete, an inheritance rather than a living science. Within this long arc, the unsettling artifacts occupy an ambiguous space. They are too practical to be purely symbolic, yet too rare to define an era. They sit at the edges of classification, protected by institutions designed to preserve order, not to question origins. Each one suggests a moment when practice outran explanation, when doing preceded understanding, or perhaps when understanding was once fuller and later thinned. The quiet erosion of explanation is not dramatic. It leaves no charred layers, no broken walls. It leaves polished surfaces, intact seals, objects carefully stored and gently misunderstood. And it raises a difficult thought, that civilizations can lose depth without losing form, that they can carry forward results long after forgetting the reasons behind them. If that is so, then the artifacts that trouble us may not belong to a different time at all. They may belong to a different phase of memory, one that history, in its pursuit of order, has learned to overlook. Distance, over centuries, has a way of smoothing sharp questions into quiet assumptions. By the time Mesopotamian knowledge travels beyond its own soil, it often does so stripped of context, carried as fragments admired for their precision rather than examined for their origins. This transition becomes visible when later civilizations encounter the legacy of Sumer not as living practice, but as inherited authority. By the first millennium BC, Babylonian and Assyrian scholars are already looking backward. They study tablets written hundreds, sometimes thousands, of years earlier. Astronomical observations begun under Sumerian scribes are continued meticulously, tracking planetary cycles across generations. The motion of Venus is recorded with such care that modern astronomers can still identify the data sets. Mathematical tables are copied again and again, preserving methods for solving problems that remain elegant even by contemporary standards. Yet these scholars rarely explain why the systems are structured as they are. They use base 60 because it is what has always been used. They trust ratios because they have always worked. When Greek travelers and thinkers arrive in Mesopotamia, they encounter this accumulated knowledge as something ancient and complete. Herodotus notes Babylonian astronomy. Later writers acknowledge that mathematical and observational traditions in the Near East predate their own. But what crosses cultural boundaries most easily are results, not processes. A calendar can be adopted. A numerical system can be learned. A method can be applied. The deeper history of how such systems came into being often remains local, embedded in stories and rituals that do not translate. This matters because it shapes how anomalies are interpreted. An object whose purpose is unclear to its immediate heirs becomes even more opaque to outsiders. Without the scaffolding of cultural memory, it is easier to classify such an object as symbolic or decorative than to entertain the possibility that it embodies a technique no longer understood. The absence of explanation becomes a justification for dismissal. Archaeology, emerging in the 19th century, inherits this layered distance. Excavators approach Mesopotamian sites with expectations shaped by linear models of progress. Stone tools lead to metal. Simple forms lead to complex ones. When an artifact violates that sequence, the impulse is to find a place for it that does not disrupt the broader framework. Museum labels reflect this caution. Unknown function. Ritual object. Neutral words that acknowledge uncertainty while containing its implications. Yet even caution leaves traces. Curators notice when corrosion patterns do not match burial conditions. Researchers note when optical properties exceed decorative needs. Engineers attempting to replicate ancient stonework encounter limits that provoke quiet reevaluation. These observations accumulate slowly, rarely forming headlines, but they persist in footnotes and specialized studies, waiting for a context that allows them to be considered together. The deeper question is not whether ancient peoples were capable of remarkable ingenuity. That is no longer in doubt. The question is how societies manage knowledge across time. What is actively taught, what is ritually preserved, and what is allowed to fade into habit without explanation. Civilizations are adept at transmitting outcomes. They are less reliable at transmitting curiosity. As Mesopotamian influence disperses and transforms, the artifacts that trouble modern classification recede further into the background. They are no longer part of a narrative of progress or decline. They become isolated curiosities, admired briefly and then set aside. Their silence deepens with each generation that inherits them without context. And yet silence does not mean emptiness. It means compression, meaning folded inward, waiting for a different kind of attention. The unsettling possibility is that what we encounter as anomalies are not mistakes in the record, but reminders of how easily explanation can be lost even when evidence survives. If knowledge once traveled alongside these objects and then slipped away, what remains is not proof of impossibility, but a measure of how selective memory can be. And that selectivity, once established, shapes every story that follows. Silence in the archaeological record often invites speculation, but it also invites patience. The past rarely offers complete answers. It offers traces, and it is the work of interpretation that binds them into meaning. By the time we reach the later phases of Mesopotamian history, the traces become increasingly entangled with systems designed to manage memory itself, libraries, canons, and traditions that decide what is preserved and what is allowed to recede. The Assyrian kings of the 7th century BCE understood the power of preservation. Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh gathered thousands of tablets from across Mesopotamia, copying texts that were already ancient by his time. Myths, medical recipes, astronomical tables, ritual instructions, all were collected and standardized. This was not merely scholarship, it was control. To define the past was to stabilize the present. In such a system, knowledge that resisted classification could survive physically while losing interpretive space. It remained, but it was no longer central. This narrowing of interpretive space affects how we encounter unusual artifacts today. An object preserved without context becomes a problem deferred rather than solved. Its existence is acknowledged, but its implications are softened by distance. Over centuries, the lack of explanation hardens into assumption. If no explanation was recorded, perhaps none existed. Yet this logic mistakes absence of commentary for absence of understanding. The archaeological record itself cautions against such certainty. Many ancient techniques are known to have been practiced long before they were formally described. The production of glass, the smelting of complex alloys, and the construction of precise water management systems often precede theoretical explanation by centuries. Practical knowledge does not always announce itself in writing. It is taught by demonstration, repetition, and apprenticeship. When those chains break, the written record can remain deceptively complete while the living knowledge disappears. This gap between practice and explanation is where the unsettling artifacts reside. They do not demand a revision of history so much as a re-evaluation of how history records competence. A device that produces an effect does not require its makers to articulate a theory in modern terms. It requires only that they know how to reproduce the result. Over time, that know-how can survive as ritualized instruction, stripped of inquiry, embedded in tradition. Such patterns are visible across cultures. In Egypt, monumental stonework reaches a precision that later periods do not surpass. In the Indus Valley, urban planning and sanitation systems appear suddenly and then vanish. In Anatolia, megalithic construction emerges before agriculture and then recedes. These are not proofs of lost global civilizations, but reminders that human capability does not always align with our timelines of explanation. Mesopotamia, with its long memory and frequent disruptions, provides a particularly clear lens for this phenomenon. Floods, migrations, and political upheavals repeatedly reorganize society. Each reorganization favors certain forms of knowledge over others. What aids administration and control is preserved. What sits at the margins, specialized tools, rare techniques, subtle effects, risks being sidelined. By the time modern scholars begin to catalog these objects, the original web of meaning has already thinned. The question becomes not whether the artifacts are real, they are, but whether our frameworks are flexible enough to accommodate them. Do we allow for the possibility that ancient knowledge moved in fits and starts, that it could advance, retreat, and advance again? Or do we insist on a smooth narrative that leaves no room for interruption? As these questions linger, the artifacts remain unchanged. Copper darkens. Clay cracks. Crystal catches light when it happens to fall at the right angle. They do not argue for themselves. They simply persist. And in that persistence lies a quiet challenge, to listen not only for what history tells us, but for what it no longer explains. By the time modern archaeology begins to take shape, the distance between observer and observed has grown vast. 19th century excavators arrive in Mesopotamia carrying assumptions shaped by industrial Europe, by steam, electricity, and a belief in uninterrupted progress. They come expecting origins, simple tools, gradual improvement, a clear ascent. What they encounter instead is maturity without rehearsal, writing without drafts, cities without prototypes, and scattered among these achievements, objects that feel strangely familiar in function, yet profoundly out of place in time. This tension quietly shapes how discoveries are framed. Early field reports describe anomalies with caution, often relegating them to appendices or footnotes. Precision drilling is noted, but not emphasized. Optical stone is cataloged, but not interrogated. A clay jar with copper and iron components is described, measured, photographed, and then placed in storage. None of this is conspiracy. It is habit. Archaeology, like any discipline, depends on consensus, and consensus favors continuity over rupture. As the 20th century progresses, experimental archaeology begins to test ancient techniques. Researchers reconstruct copper drills, bow-driven shafts, abrasive sands. They replicate stone vessels, sometimes achieving remarkable results, yet rarely matching the consistency seen in certain ancient examples. The gap is not insurmountable, but it remains. Replication explains much, but not everything. The results are close enough to reassure, yet distant enough to leave unease unresolved. At the same time, scientific analysis deepens. Microscopy reveals tool marks invisible to the naked eye. Chemical testing distinguishes burial corrosion from use-related residue. In some cases, the data complicates earlier assumptions. Corrosion patterns suggest repeated exposure rather than accident. Optical measurements confirm functional curvature. Voltage, once tested, proves measurable. None of these findings rewrite history, but each one narrows the space available for dismissal. Still, interpretation lags behind evidence. To acknowledge functional devices in ancient contexts raises uncomfortable questions. Who used them? For what purpose? Why do texts not describe them explicitly? The simplest answer, that ancient people stumbled upon effects without understanding them, offers relief. It preserves linear progress while granting ancient ingenuity. But simplicity is not the same as accuracy. The deeper difficulty lies in our expectations of explanation. Modern science privileges theory articulated in words and symbols. Ancient knowledge often privileges outcome. If a process works, it is retained. If it does not, it is abandoned. Explanation, when it exists, may be embedded in metaphor, ritual, or authority rather than abstraction. A procedure may be justified because it was given, not because it was derived. This difference matters when we confront silence. The absence of explicit description does not imply ignorance. It may imply confidence so complete that explanation felt unnecessary, or secrecy, where certain techniques were restricted to small groups, or loss, where the chain of transmission broke while the object survived. Each possibility fits the evidence differently, and none can be proven outright. As debates continue quietly in academic circles, public narratives simplify. Museums favor clarity. Documentaries favor resolution. Anomalies are either sensationalized or ignored. Rarely are they allowed to remain unresolved in a space between skepticism and wonder. Yet it is precisely that space where these artifacts belong. They do not demand belief in lost golden ages or forgotten empires. They ask something subtler. They ask whether history's greatest losses might be conceptual rather than material. Whether methods can outlive meanings. Whether continuity of practice can mask discontinuity of understanding. The past does not owe us coherence. It offers fragments shaped by survival. And when those fragments refuse to align neatly, the discomfort may not signal error, but limitation, our own. If we listen carefully, the anomalies are not shouting that history is wrong. They are whispering that it is incomplete, and that what feels impossible may simply belong to a logic we have not yet learned how to hear. Incompleteness becomes more visible when attention shifts from objects to systems. Tools can survive in isolation, but the environments that gave them meaning are more fragile. In Mesopotamia, systems of knowledge were once woven into daily life, into calendars that governed planting, into rituals that marked transitions, into measurements that organized labor and land. When those systems fracture, what remains can appear strangely advanced, not because it was ahead of its time, but because the framework that explained it no longer exists. One of the clearest examples of this persistence is time itself. The Sumerian division of the hour into 60 parts and the circle into 360 degrees survives intact into the present. Few people pause to ask why these numbers were chosen, only that they work. Mathematically, 60 is convenient, divisible by many integers. Practically, it simplifies fractions. Yet convenience does not explain origin. Someone recognized its utility, tested it, and embedded it so deeply into practice that it outlived the culture that formalized it. The system endured because it functioned, not because its creators left a treatise defending it. The same quiet endurance characterizes Mesopotamian astronomy. Observations of the sky were not abstract curiosities. They governed ritual calendars, agricultural cycles, and political legitimacy. Kings ruled under stars that had to be read correctly. Over centuries, data accumulated. Patterns emerged. Venus cycles were charted. Eclipses noted. The sky became predictable, not through theory as we would recognize it, but through disciplined observation. This is science in practice, even if it does not announce itself as such. Within such a worldview, the boundary between technical and sacred knowledge blurs. A procedure that yields a reliable effect acquires authority. Its explanation may be mythic, but its reliability is empirical. When later observers encounter the result without the ritual or observational context, the effect seems disproportionate to the explanation offered. The object appears advanced. The story appears thin. This tension is mirrored in the way ancient people understood materials. Copper, iron, bitumen, crystal, each carried symbolic meaning alongside practical properties. Working with them required skill, patience, and familiarity born of repetition. A craftsperson did not need to articulate electrochemical principles to notice that certain combinations produced sensations or reactions. Nor did they need modern optics to recognize that shaped crystal enhanced vision. What mattered was consistency, not explanation. As these practices became embedded, they could be transmitted intact even as their rationale faded. A master taught an apprentice how, not why. Over generations, the why became sacred, metaphorical, or forgotten. When disruption occurred, flood, conquest, migration, the chain of explanation weakened further. What survived were instructions, gestures, and objects. This perspective reframes the unsettling artifacts. They are not intrusions from the future. They are residues of continuity shaped by loss. Their sophistication reflects the durability of methods, not the presence of anachronistic theory. They feel advanced because we encounter them stripped of their surrounding practices, like equations without derivations. Modern discomfort arises from expecting a one-to-one correspondence between artifact and explanation. When that correspondence fails, suspicion fills the gap. Yet history is full of practices that outpaced understanding. Navigation before physics, medicine before biology, engineering before calculus. Mesopotamia may simply represent an earlier instance of this pattern, amplified by catastrophic interruption. The question, then, is not whether ancient people knew what we know. It is whether they knew different things, in different ways, and whether those ways left traces we no longer recognize as knowledge. If the artifacts unsettle us, it may be because they expose an assumption we rarely question, that understanding must always precede application. In the long arc of human history, the reverse is often true. As application persists without explanation, authority begins to replace understanding. When a method works reliably, it becomes part of the order of things, protected not by curiosity but by reverence. In Mesopotamia, this transition is visible in the way technical knowledge becomes inseparable from power. Kings do not rule alone. They rule through alignment with cosmic order, measured time, regulated space, and inherited procedure. To alter those procedures would be to risk instability itself. By the Old Babylonian period, legal codes, architectural norms, and ritual calendars are presented as continuations of ancient precedent. Hammurabi's laws, carved in stone around the 18th century BCE, are framed not as innovation but as restoration of justice long established. The language is revealing. Authority flows backward, not forward. What legitimizes the present is its resemblance to a past already sanctified. In such a climate, questioning origins becomes unnecessary, even dangerous. This posture affects how specialized knowledge is handled. Certain crafts remain confined to narrow circles: metalworkers, stone carvers, scribes, each operating within inherited boundaries. Their expertise is respected, but rarely dissected. A successful technique is maintained because deviation threatens failure. Over time, the act of preserving becomes more important than the act of understanding. Knowledge survives, but its edges dull. Archaeological evidence suggests that some technologies plateau under these conditions. Stoneworking achieves remarkable precision early and then stabilizes. Astronomical observation becomes increasingly exact, yet remains descriptive rather than theoretical. Mathematics solves practical problems elegantly but does not seek abstraction for its own sake. These are not shortcomings. They are reflections of a culture focused on stability. Yet stability has a cost. It resists reinterpretation. When later disruptions occur, foreign conquest, economic strain, environmental stress, the fragility of this arrangement becomes apparent. Systems designed to preserve order struggle to adapt. The techniques remain, but the institutions that supported them weaken. What was once maintained through continuity must now survive through habit alone. In this narrowing space, unusual objects risk misinterpretation even within their own culture. A device used rarely, by few, may lose its context first. Its function becomes symbolic, its explanation ceremonial. Future generations inherit the object without the framework that once gave it clarity. By the time external observers encounter it, the silence feels absolute. Modern historians often assume that if knowledge existed, it would have been widely disseminated or clearly documented. Mesopotamia challenges that assumption. Much of its technical tradition appears to have been guarded, hierarchical, and conservative. Knowledge was power, and power was not shared freely. A method confined to temple workshops or royal projects could leave few traces beyond the objects themselves. This realization complicates the question of intention. Did ancient craftsmen understand the principles behind their tools? Perhaps some did, in ways that did not translate into abstract language. Perhaps others followed instructions whose origins were already obscure. Both possibilities coexist comfortably within a culture that valued continuity over explanation. As centuries pass, the cumulative effect of this approach becomes visible. Artifacts outlive meanings. Practices outlive rationales. Results outlive curiosity. What reaches us is not a clear lineage of discovery, but a mosaic of survivals shaped by selection, reverence, and loss. The unsettling feeling returns here, quieter but deeper. If civilizations can preserve effectiveness while forgetting explanation, then the absence of theory in the past tells us less about capability than we assume. And if that is true, then the artifacts that trouble us are not demanding extraordinary claims. They are asking us to reconsider how much of human understanding history allows itself to remember. When stretched across millennia, has a way of rearranging emphasis. What once stood at the center of a civilization's attention can drift toward the margins without ever disappearing. By the late first millennium BC, Mesopotamia is no longer the unquestioned heart of the world it once organized. Power shifts west and east. New empires rise with different priorities. Yet the intellectual residue of Sumer persists, embedded quietly in practices that continue long after their origins fade from view. Under Persian rule and later Hellenistic influence, Mesopotamian knowledge is absorbed into broader administrative systems. Astronomical records remain valuable for calendars and omens. Mathematical techniques continue to serve taxation and engineering. But the cultural framing that once treated these practices as sacred inheritances begins to loosen. Knowledge becomes more transferable, less bound to a single tradition. In that transition, fragments survive without their original coherence. Greek scholars encountering Near Eastern learning often translate results into their own conceptual language. Numbers become geometry. Observations become theory. The emphasis shifts toward explanation rather than preservation. This shift is powerful, but it also filters what is noticed. Techniques that cannot be easily abstracted are less likely to be recorded. Practical methods that do not align with emerging theoretical frameworks risk being dismissed as curiosities rather than investigated as systems. The result is a second kind of loss, quieter than flood or conquest. It is a loss of relevance. An object that once fit naturally into a web of ritual, craft, and authority now appears isolated. Its purpose is no longer obvious, its value uncertain. It remains physically present but conceptually homeless. Over time, such objects are stored, reclassified, or simply overlooked. Archaeology, centuries later, inherits this layered forgetting. Excavators retrieve artifacts already stripped of their interpretive context twice over, first by ancient disruptions, then by shifts in intellectual tradition. When modern scholars attempt to reconstruct meaning, they do so through frameworks shaped by their own history of science. Effects are measured, functions are tested, yet meaning resists measurement. It requires cultural proximity that no longer exists. This distance explains why debates about intention remain unresolved. Was a device meant to generate a physical effect, or was the effect incidental? Was precision sought for functional necessity, or for symbolic perfection? These questions assume a separation that ancient cultures may not have recognized. In a worldview where the sacred and the practical interpenetrate, usefulness and meaning are not mutually exclusive. The temptation is to resolve ambiguity by choosing a side. Either the artifact is technological or it is ritual. Either it represents lost science or it represents coincidence. But ancient practice rarely conforms to such binaries. A tool can be both functional and symbolic. A method can be both practical and sacred. When explanation fades, these distinctions collapse. What remains is a pattern of survivals that refuse to align neatly with modern categories. They challenge not because they prove something extraordinary, but because they expose the limits of our interpretive habits. We want origins, causes, clear trajectories. The past offers continuity punctuated by erasure. As Mesopotamia recedes into antiquity, its artifacts continue their quiet journey through time. They pass from workshop to ruin, from ruin to collection, from collection to catalog. Each transition preserves material while thinning meaning. And with each thinning, the distance between what was done and what was understood grows harder to bridge. The unease this creates is not an accusation against history, but an invitation to consider that knowledge does not always travel intact, that civilizations can be both sophisticated and forgetful, and that what we inherit from the deep past may be less a complete story than a series of carefully preserved outcomes, waiting for a different kind of listening to ask what has been left unsaid. When meaning thins enough, speculation begins to rush in to fill the space it leaves behind. This is not a modern flaw, it is a human response to silence. Faced with artifacts that persist without explanation, every era supplies its own answers, shaped by its fears and expectations. For Mesopotamian remnants, that process becomes especially visible in the modern imagination, where gaps in knowledge are often treated as invitations to certainty rather than patience. Some interpretations lean toward exaggeration, imagining lost empires of impossible sophistication or external teachers arriving fully formed. Others retreat in the opposite direction, minimizing anomalies until they dissolve into coincidence. Both responses share a common impulse: discomfort with ambiguity. Yet ambiguity may be the most historically honest position available. The evidence we possess does not demand extraordinary conclusions. It demands restraint. What archaeology consistently shows is not a forgotten world of machines, but a forgotten world of continuity. Knowledge moved through lineages, guilds, and institutions that did not prioritize explanation in the way modern science does. A stoneworker learned by watching hands, not by reading treatises. A scribe memorized procedures, not theories. When these chains broke, the object remained, but the pedagogy vanished. Later observers inherit results without the means to reconstruct the reasoning that produced them. This dynamic is visible in experimental reconstructions. Modern craftspeople can reproduce many ancient techniques once dismissed as impossible, given sufficient time and skill. Yet even successful replication often leaves questions unanswered. Why was this method chosen over others? Why this level of precision? Why this particular configuration? The answers are rarely technical alone. They are cultural, bound to values of order, balance, and ritual completeness that modern frameworks struggle to quantify. Mesopotamian society placed immense importance on alignment between heaven and earth, ruler and cosmos, ritual and calendar. Precision was not merely practical, it was moral. A well-cut stone or a carefully proportioned vessel reflected harmony with the universe. In such a worldview, pushing materials to their limits was not innovation for its own sake, but an expression of order. Techniques that achieved reliable results were repeated because they aligned with this deeper sense of correctness. Seen this way, the unsettling artifacts lose some of their strangeness. They are not intrusions from a future science, but expressions of a culture that valued effectiveness, repetition, and cosmic correspondence. Their sophistication reflects dedication rather than theoretical abstraction. The surprise lies not in what ancient people could do, but in how narrowly we define understanding. The modern tendency to frame history as a sequence of breakthroughs obscures another reality. Much of human knowledge is incremental, embodied, and easily lost when social structures change. Catastrophe accelerates that loss. Floods erase settlements. Conquests dismantle institutions. New regimes reframe the past to legitimize themselves. In each transition, certain skills survive because they are useful or revered. Others fade because they are peripheral or poorly understood. By the time we encounter the artifacts that trouble us, they have already passed through multiple filters of selection. What survives is not representative, it is exceptional. Exceptional objects invite exceptional interpretations, but they may simply be the most durable traces of ordinary practices once widespread within narrow circles. This perspective does not strip the past of mystery. It deepens it. It suggests that what we are missing is not a single lost civilization, but countless small explanations, moments of instruction, gestures of teaching that left no durable mark. The past becomes quieter, not emptier. As we move closer to the present, the question shifts. It is no longer about what ancient people knew, but about what we expect knowledge to look like. Do we recognize skill when it is not accompanied by theory? Do we accept effectiveness without explanation? Or do we dismiss it until it fits our categories? The artifacts remain patient. They do not resolve these questions. They endure them. And in doing so, they invite a different posture, one that resists the urge to conclude, that allows uncertainty to remain productive. The deeper the silence, the more carefully it must be approached. As the silence deepens, the modern impulse to sort, classify, and conclude grows stronger. We want the past to answer us, to confirm that our methods are sufficient, that our timelines are stable. Yet the deeper one listens to Mesopotamia, the clearer it becomes that certainty was never the goal. What mattered was continuity, keeping the world legible, season after season, generation after generation. Truth was measured not by explanation, but by endurance. This attitude shaped how knowledge interacted with authority. Kings did not rule by innovation, they ruled by alignment. Their legitimacy rested on the claim that they maintained cosmic balance, that they restored order when it faltered. Inscriptions rarely celebrate discovery. They celebrate preservation. A canal repaired, a temple rebuilt, a ritual reinstated. Even when empires expanded through conquest, they justified themselves by appealing to ancient precedent. The past was not something to surpass, but something to inhabit. Within such a framework, technological curiosity had limits. Exploration that threatened stability was unnecessary. A method that worked was sufficient. Over time, this posture hardened into conservatism. Techniques were inherited intact, while the conditions that produced them faded. What began as mastery gradually became ritualized competence. This helps explain why certain practices appear fully formed when they first enter the archaeological record. They were not new, they were already proven. Their developmental history lies beyond the horizon of what survived. Floods erased workshops. Social collapse dismantled training lineages. Oral instruction left no trace once its speakers were gone. What remains is the endpoint of a process whose beginnings are no longer visible. The effect is subtle but profound. When modern scholars encounter these endpoints, they measure them against reconstructed beginnings that may not correspond. The comparison feels unbalanced. The artifact seems too refined. The timeline feels compressed. Yet the imbalance may lie in the reconstruction, not the past. Consider how easily modern societies lose technical depth. Entire industries rely on processes few fully understand. Skills persist through repetition and institutional memory rather than comprehension by individuals. If disruption were severe enough, if archives vanished, if specialists were lost, future observers might encounter sophisticated results without access to their rationale. They might mistake continuity for anomaly. Mesopotamia lived through repeated disruptions. Climatic shifts altered river behavior. Political upheavals reshaped institutions. Languages changed. Writing systems evolved. Each transition filtered knowledge. What remained was what could be carried, copied, and reused. The rest dissolved. In this light, the artifacts that trouble us are not evidence of something impossible. They are evidence of something fragile. They show how easily explanation can vanish while function remains. How outcomes can travel through time detached from their origins. How a civilization can be both highly capable and partially amnesiac. The question that emerges is not about lost genius, but about loss itself. What kinds of understanding survive catastrophe? What kinds are erased? Practical skills, embodied in hands and habits, often endure longer than abstract reasoning. Sacred framing preserves procedure even when inquiry ceases. Authority stabilizes method while discouraging exploration. As the story draws closer to its unresolved center, the unease sharpens. If the past can forget so much while appearing complete, what does that imply about our own moment? Which of our explanations will endure, and which will thin into ritual? Which of our technologies will survive as artifacts without context? The Mesopotamian objects remain still, unchanged by these questions. They do not accuse. They do not persuade. They simply persist, carrying with them the quiet reminder that history is not a straight line, but a terrain shaped by floods, of water, of power, of forgetting. And in that terrain, the most important losses may be the ones that leave no visible ruin at all. When attention lingers long enough on what has been forgotten, a different pattern begins to surface. Not one of disappearance, but of narrowing. Over time, societies learn which questions are safe to ask and which ones quietly fade from use. In Mesopotamia, as elsewhere, survival favored predictability. The future had to resemble the past closely enough to remain manageable. Curiosity that reached too far beyond established order risked destabilizing the delicate balance between land, labor, and authority. This narrowing shaped how history itself was preserved. Scribes were trained to copy faithfully, not to reinterpret. Variations were minimized. Deviations corrected. The written record became increasingly polished, less reflective of uncertainty. In such a system, events that could not be easily integrated into an accepted narrative were softened, compressed, or reframed. Floods became moral tests. Disruptions became divine will. Loss became lesson. The language absorbed rupture until it appeared inevitable. This is not deception. It is adaptation. When continuity is fragile, explanation becomes secondary to cohesion. A story that holds society together is more valuable than one that exposes its fractures. Over generations, this preference reshapes memory. What survives is not a complete account, but a usable one. Archaeology encounters the consequences of this process in reverse. It uncovers fragments stripped of their narrative insulation, a vessel without its story, a technique without its justification, a result without its rationale. Modern interpretation attempts to rebuild meaning from material alone, often underestimating how much was once carried in human memory, gesture, and ritual. The unsettling artifacts sit precisely at this intersection. They appear more advanced than expected because the context that normalized them has collapsed. Their survival is accidental. Their silence is structural. They are not messages left for the future. They are remnants that escaped erasure by chance. This perspective reframes the urge to locate a single cause for historical discontinuity. It may not have been one flood, one collapse, or one act of suppression. It may have been accumulation, many small disruptions layered over time, each one trimming the edges of understanding. Knowledge narrowed not because it was forbidden, but because it was no longer required to be expansive. The idea of deliberate control inevitably arises here, not as a shadowy conspiracy, but as institutional inertia. Systems of education, belief, and authority naturally preserve what sustains them. They filter out what complicates governance. Over centuries, this filtering shapes what counts as history. The past becomes stable by becoming selective. This does not mean that alternative understandings vanished entirely. They persisted in marginal spaces, craft traditions, ritual practices, specialized tools, often invisible to official records. When those spaces disappeared, the knowledge they carried disappeared with them. What remains is a puzzle assembled from what authority found worth keeping. Seen this way, the discomfort these artifacts produce is not about their age or function. It is about what they reveal concerning historical memory. They expose how much of the past is shaped by decisions about relevance rather than truth. They hint at layers of experience flattened by time. As the narrative approaches its most uncertain ground, the temptation to resolve the mystery grows stronger. Yet resolution may be the least faithful response. The past does not offer closure. It offers perspective. The artifacts endure not to be explained away, but to remind us that history is always incomplete, always edited by survival. The question left hanging is not whether something has been hidden, but whether we are prepared to accept how much has been lost without trace. If civilizations can forget so thoroughly while appearing continuous, then the boundaries of what we call possible are narrower than the past itself. And that realization, once allowed to settle, alters how every ancient object is seen, not as an answer, but as an invitation to listen more carefully to what remains unsaid. As listening replaces explanation, the past begins to feel less like a sequence of events and more like a pressure, something shaping the present without fully revealing itself. By this stage in the journey, the artifact is no longer just an object. It has become a lens through which the mechanics of historical memory come into focus. What it reflects back is not certainty, but pattern, repetition, loss, reassembly. Across Mesopotamian history, collapse is rarely final. Cities fall, but cities return. Names change, borders shift, languages evolve, yet the same riverbanks are settled again and again. Each return carries echoes of what came before, but never the whole. Irrigation canals are rebuilt along older lines. Temples rise atop earlier foundations. Administrative systems reuse inherited measures. Continuity persists, but depth is reduced. This reduction has consequences. When societies rebuild quickly, they prioritize what can be restored efficiently. Techniques that are difficult to teach, explain, or justify may survive only in abbreviated form. A procedure becomes a rule. A rule becomes ritual. Over time, the ritual remains even as the conditions that produced it disappear. What once required understanding now requires obedience. In this environment, knowledge fragments naturally. Some skills become common, others rare. Some are absorbed into everyday practice, others retreat into specialized enclaves. The more specialized a technique, the more vulnerable it becomes to disruption. A flood wipes out a workshop. A war disperses artisans. A change in patronage dissolves a guild. The knowledge does not vanish all at once. It thins. The artifacts that unsettle us likely belonged to these thinning margins. They were never widespread. They did not define an age. They served particular purposes, known to few, practiced quietly. When the supporting structures disappeared, the objects remained as residue. Their scarcity today reflects their scarcity then. This scarcity complicates interpretation. A rare object resists pattern building. It invites speculation precisely because it cannot be easily contextualized. Modern frameworks struggle with this. We are trained to extrapolate from samples, to generalize from trends. But history often survives as exception, not rule. What endures is what escaped erasure, not what was most common. The temptation at this point is to resolve the tension by introducing an external cause. A lost civilization, a hidden elite, a suppressed truth. These narratives offer closure. They explain absence by intention rather than entropy. Yet entropy is slow. Cumulative loss is the quieter and often more accurate explanation. Mesopotamia demonstrates how entropy operates culturally. Writing preserves some things and excludes others. Monumental architecture outlasts domestic life. Administrative records survive where oral instruction does not. Over centuries, what is easiest to store becomes what defines the past. What is hardest to preserve disappears first. The artifact sits at the intersection of these forces. It is material enough to survive, but contextual enough to confuse. It belongs to a category of knowledge that resists textualization. Its function may have been known, even relied upon, without ever being formally articulated. When that knowledge ceased to be practiced, nothing in the written record stepped in to replace it. What remains, then, is not a riddle demanding a single answer, but a mirror reflecting our assumptions. We expect history to be cumulative. We expect knowledge to expand. We expect explanation to accompany effect. The artifact quietly contradicts all three. As this realization settles, the tone of the question changes. It is no longer, "How could this exist?" It becomes, "What else once existed, worked, and was forgotten?" The ground beneath ancient cities holds countless possibilities, most of which will never surface. The record we have is not representative. It is selective, accidental, shaped by survival. The artifact endures not as proof of a lost world, but as evidence of loss itself. A reminder that human capability has always exceeded what history manages to remember. And if that is true, then the most profound mysteries of the ancient world are not hidden in secret chambers or forbidden texts. They are hidden in the ordinary spaces where knowledge once passed from hand to hand, unrecorded, and then fell silent. As silence accumulates, the weight of continuity begins to feel deceptive. The world appears stable on the surface, yet beneath it, entire layers of experience have compressed into absence. By now, the artifact no longer feels anomalous. It feels symptomatic, a sign that history preserves outcomes far more faithfully than it preserves processes, and that what survives often gives a false impression of completeness. This becomes especially clear when attention turns to scale. Civilizations are remembered through their monuments, their laws, their calendars. But most knowledge never reaches that scale. It lives in workshops, in kitchens, in the hands of specialists whose work is essential yet undocumented. When disruption arrives, it is these spaces that vanish first. The archive remains. The monument remains. The subtle practices dissolve. Mesopotamian society relied on countless such practices. Canal gradients had to be calculated precisely to prevent stagnation or erosion. Metallurgy required careful control of heat, timing, and mixture. Stone carving demanded knowledge of grain, pressure, and rhythm that could not be fully captured in writing. These skills were transmitted bodily through repetition, correction, and observation. Their disappearance leaves little trace beyond the results they once produced. This imbalance shapes modern perception. We encounter polished artifacts without encountering the learning that shaped them. The absence of instruction invites assumptions about impossibility. But impossibility is often a projection of our own habits. We trust written explanation more than embodied knowledge. We assume that if something mattered, it would have been recorded. Mesopotamia quietly contradicts that assumption. Even within written culture, selection was constant. Tablets were reused, recopied, or discarded based on relevance. Archives were curated. Libraries were political projects. What entered them was already filtered. What remained outside them, workshop routines, local innovations, practical shortcuts, was always at risk. Over centuries, that risk became certainty. This is where the modern desire for revelation encounters its limit. There may be no hidden chamber, no missing text that resolves the puzzle. The loss may be structural rather than secret. Knowledge did not vanish because it was erased. It vanished because it was never designed to survive beyond practice. When practice ended, so did memory. The artifact, then, is not a message sent forward in time. It is debris carried by chance. Its survival is accidental. Its confusion is inevitable. We ask it questions it was never meant to answer, questions shaped by a culture that equates understanding with articulation. It responds only by existing. At this stage, the narrative could easily turn outward, toward grand explanations that promise coherence. But coherence may be precisely what the past does not offer. Human history is uneven. Capabilities emerge, stabilize, fragment, and re-emerge in altered forms. Progress is not a line. It is a pattern of accumulation and loss. Mesopotamia exemplifies this pattern because it endured for so long under unstable conditions. Its people adapted repeatedly, rebuilding from fragments, preserving what could be carried, abandoning what could not. Each rebuilding produced a culture that felt complete to those living within it, even as it rested on absences invisible to them. The artifact unsettles because it exposes one of those absences. It suggests that what we see as the beginning may already be a middle, that what appears sudden may be restored, that what feels advanced may simply be the residue of continuity extended across breaks we no longer perceive. This is so. Then the question shifts again. It is no longer about whether ancient people possessed knowledge beyond their time. It is about whether time itself is the right measure for understanding capability. Skills do not belong neatly to eras. They belong to contexts. When contexts vanish, skills appear displaced. The artifact waits within that displacement. It does not accuse history of error. It reveals history's compression. It reminds us that forgetting is not an event, but a process, one that unfolds quietly, without ceremony, leaving behind objects that seem to whisper of impossibility only because we have lost the habit of listening for continuity. As the journey approaches its final uncertainty, one realization grows clearer. The most fragile element of any civilization is not its tools or its monuments. It is the web of understanding that makes those tools ordinary. When that web dissolves, what remains looks extraordinary. And it is in that transformation, from ordinary to inexplicable, that the deepest mystery of the ancient world resides. By the time the ordinary has transformed into the inexplicable, distance has done its quiet work. The artifact now sits far removed from the hands that once handled it without wonder. It is enclosed in glass, catalogued by number, isolated from the environment that once made it unremarkable. This isolation creates an illusion that the object is singular, exceptional, almost deliberate in its defiance of history. Yet its strangeness may be the result of removal rather than intention. In its original setting, the artifact would not have stood alone. It would have existed among tools, materials, routines, and gestures that clarified its purpose without words. A workshop is a language of its own. The placement of objects, the order of actions, the rhythm of repetition, all communicate meaning. When that language is lost, the remaining object appears mute, even misleading. We mistake silence for secrecy. Museums preserve objects by freezing them in time, but freezing also erases use. Where becomes damage, residue becomes contamination. Function becomes hypothesis. This transformation is necessary for conservation, yet it subtly alters interpretation. The artifact's story becomes speculative, shaped by what is visible rather than what was done. The gap between evidence and experience widens. This gap is where modern anxiety enters. Faced with an object that appears to exceed its context, we ask whether something has been deliberately concealed. We imagine knowledge withheld, histories rewritten, truths suppressed. Such ideas reflect a modern relationship with information, one shaped by institutions that do control narratives. Yet ancient loss rarely operated through concealment. It operated through neglect, through the quiet disappearance of contexts deemed unnecessary to record. Mesopotamian history offers many examples of this selective survival. Entire professions vanish from the record not because they were unimportant, but because they were taken for granted. The builders who understood how to align structures with subtle gradients are unnamed. The metalworkers who refined alloys leave no biographies. The teachers who transmitted procedures leave no signatures. Their work remains, their voices do not. This absence creates a temptation to fill the void with intention. But intention implies continuity of power, whereas much of ancient history is discontinuous. Empires fall abruptly. Libraries burn or decay. Populations disperse. Knowledge transmission fractures. In such conditions, forgetting is not a choice, it is a consequence. The artifact becomes a casualty of this process, not a survivor with a message, but a remnant without an audience. Its presence today is an accident of durability. Its confusion is an accident of loss. The more carefully we examine it, the clearer this becomes. There is no signal of warning embedded within it, no marker of forbidden insight. There is only evidence of use. And use implies normality. Whatever the artifact did, it did so often enough to leave traces. It belonged to a routine stable enough to be repeated, yet fragile enough to vanish. That paradox defines much of human history. Entire ways of working can persist for centuries and then disappear within a generation when conditions shift. As the inquiry nears its end, the emotional center shifts again. The question is no longer what the artifact proves, but what it reveals about us. Our discomfort arises from the assumption that knowledge must leave explanations behind. When it does not, we suspect manipulation. Yet history suggests a simpler, more unsettling truth, that most knowledge was never designed to survive abstraction. The artifact asks for humility rather than revelation. It invites us to consider how much of the human past functioned effectively without leaving behind reasons we would recognize as sufficient. It challenges the idea that history is a record of understanding rather than a record of outcomes. And in that challenge lies its quiet power, not as evidence of lost brilliance beyond imagination, but as evidence of how easily brilliance becomes invisible when the conditions that sustained it disappear. The artifact does not demand belief. It asks patience. It asks whether we can sit with uncertainty without forcing it into narrative. As we prepare to move toward the final reflections, one thought lingers with increasing clarity. If the past can forget so thoroughly while appearing whole, then the future may one day look at our own remains and feel the same unease, wondering how so much could exist without explanation and mistaking loss for mystery. As the unease settles, the artifact begins to function less as evidence and more as a threshold. Standing before it, the mind oscillates between two instincts, to explain and to surrender explanation. History trains us to resolve, to assign causes and effects, to close questions once they have been sufficiently named. Yet the ancient world resists that impulse. It invites a slower form of attention, one that allows contradictions to remain without demanding reconciliation. The Sumerian record, when read patiently, does not promise completeness. It offers continuity interrupted by silence. Floods divide time. Dynasties reset order. Knowledge is described as restored, not created. Even the gods withdraw, leaving humanity to maintain structures that once felt externally guaranteed. Authority becomes internal. Responsibility shifts. The world continues, but something foundational is no longer present in the same way. This pattern echoes far beyond Mesopotamia. Civilizations everywhere remember a turning point, a time when the world changed texture, when certainty retreated and endurance replaced guidance. Myths speak of withdrawal, of separation, of distance. These are not scientific accounts, but they preserve a psychological truth that societies sense when they are living after something, not before it. In that sense, the artifact is not anomalous. It belongs to the after. It reflects a moment when humanity inherited systems without inheriting their full context. When techniques remained but frameworks thinned. When effects endured longer than explanations. The discomfort it produces is not about technology. It is about inheritance. Modern scholarship often treats inheritance as passive, ideas handed down intact until replaced by better ones. But ancient inheritance was fragile. It depended on memory, repetition, and trust. When those conditions faltered, inheritance became partial. What survived was what could function without explanation. What required interpretation vanished. The artifact, then, is not asking to be elevated into revelation. It is asking to be recognized as residue, a remainder of processes that once felt ordinary. Its presence reminds us that absence in history does not imply absence in reality. It implies absence in record. As the inquiry reaches this penultimate pause, the larger implication emerges quietly. If ancient civilizations could forget so deeply while appearing complete, then the narrative of steady accumulation we tell about ourselves is provisional at best. Knowledge does not simply build. It contracts, fragments, and sometimes survives only in practice long after meaning dissolves. This realization reframes the original question. Not, how could this object exist, but how much once existed that no longer does? The ground beneath ancient cities holds more erasure than revelation. What we see is what endured, not what defined the whole. The artifact remains patient and uninsistent. It does not confirm lost empires or hidden masters. It confirms something more subtle and more unsettling, that human capability is older, broader, and more vulnerable to forgetting than our histories admit. As the final reflection approaches, one last uncertainty remains unresolved, deliberately so. If the past is shaped as much by what it forgets as by what it remembers, then every object we recover is incomplete by nature. And perhaps the greatest error is not in failing to explain them, but in assuming they were ever meant to explain themselves at all. What remains at the far edge of this long reflection is not an answer but a posture. After all the fragments, the artifacts, the flood layers, the tablets, and the silences, the story does not resolve into certainty. It slows. It steadies. It invites a different way of looking at what history has been doing all along. The Sumerian artifact that should not exist does not stand outside the ancient world. It stands inside its fractures. It belongs to a landscape shaped by repetition and erasure, by rebuilding atop buried foundations, by knowledge carried forward without explanation because explanation was not what ensured survival. Its presence does not demand that we rewrite the past as a tale of lost technological golden ages. It asks something quieter and more difficult, that we acknowledge how much of human capability has always lived outside the stories we preserve. Civilizations do not fail because they forget everything. They fail because they forget selectively. They remember what stabilizes power, what reinforces order, what can be copied, counted, and defended. They forget what is difficult to formalize, what lives in gesture, practice, and trust. Over time, those forgotten elements leave behind objects that feel strangely advanced, not because they belong to the future, but because the present has lost the vocabulary to recognize their normality. In this light, the artifact becomes a mirror. It reflects our own assumptions back at us. That progress is linear. That knowledge accumulates without loss. That explanation always accompanies effect. The ancient world quietly contradicts all three. It shows a humanity capable of precision, observation, and subtle manipulation of materials long before modern categories existed to describe those acts. It also shows how easily that capability can slip into obscurity without leaving scandal or trace. The unease this produces is not meant to alarm. It is meant to slow the mind, to soften the demand for closure, to remind us that history is not a finished archive but an ongoing negotiation between what survives and what disappears. Every artifact we recover is incomplete, not because it hides something deliberately, but because the world that once made it intelligible no longer exists in full. As the story settles into silence, the question remains open where it belongs, not as a challenge to belief, but as an invitation to humility. If the ancient world can still unsettle us with such small, quiet objects, then perhaps the past is not finished teaching us how fragile understanding can be when stretched across deep time. For now, let the artifact return to stillness. Let the questions rest without forcing them into resolution, and consider gently what future eyes might one day make of our own remnants, our tools, our systems, our assumptions, when the explanations we take for granted have thinned into silence. Thank you for staying with this long and quiet journey. Thank you for listening without demanding certainty, for allowing unanswered questions to remain where history itself has left them, between fragments, memories, and silence. Stories like this are not meant to persuade or to conclude. They are meant to slow the mind, to loosen the grip of neat explanations, and to remind us that the past is not only what was recorded, but also what was practiced, forgotten, and carried forward without words. In the ancient world, knowledge did not always announce itself. Sometimes it endured quietly, embedded in tools, habits, and gestures that outlived the reasons behind them. At Cryptic Realm Channel, we move carefully through those quiet spaces. Through civilizations shaped by flood and rebuilding, through artifacts that resist easy placement, through questions that remain open not because they lack answers, but because answers themselves can narrow our attention too quickly. These journeys are meant to accompany you into rest, into reflection, or into that calm state where curiosity does not need resolution to feel complete. If this exploration left you feeling thoughtful, unsettled, or gently curious, you are always welcome to stay. By subscribing, you help keep these slow histories alive, stories told not to shock or convince, but to invite patience, humility, and deeper listening. There are many more fragments waiting, many more silences shaped by time, and many more questions that ask only to be held, not solved. For now, let the questions soften. Let the images fade back into shadow. And remember, understanding is not always about arriving somewhere. Sometimes it is about learning how to remain with what cannot be fully known. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying.